I want you to imagine looking at an original architectural blueprint from 1750. It describes a simple customs depot, a functional, low-tech space for horse-drawn carts and weary men with ledger books, typical of that era's official history. But when you look at the scale, you notice a paradox. The ceiling clearance is 40 feet high. 40 feet for a stable. Your logic revolts. It's too large, too costly, too precise for its stated purpose. You look closer at the same survey and see massive elevated mooring points integrated into the exterior walls, rendered simply as hitching posts in the quay. Hitching posts, except they aren't at ground level. They are 3 stories up, facing outward into open sky. If this was a horse and cart operation, why was the infrastructure designed for a giant child or a massive elevated arrival? The moment I noticed that discrepancy, the 40-foot clearance in a 17th century shed, was the moment I stopped trusting the accepted timeline of history. The deeper I looked into these surveys, the more that phrase, customs depot, felt like a translation of something else. A deliberate lie designed to cover up a missing era. This isn't a story about the Wright brothers or Kitty Hawk in 1903. This investigation begins centuries earlier, with structures that shouldn't exist, with a sophisticated hydraulic power grid we are told was never built, and with a globally coordinated network of what can only be described as old-world airports that they erase from the map. You have been taught a comfortable fiction. Stay with me, because we are about to dismantle it and look at what was really in the sky. Let me ask you a question that might sound too simple. What exactly is an airport? Strip away the modern distractions. Remove the duty-free shops, the digital departure boards, and the jet bridges. At its absolute core, stripped down to pure function, what remains? You need a massive, flat, unobstructed approach corridor that is carefully graded. You need architectural structures capable of sheltering enormous aerial vehicles from severe weather. You need elevated mast or anchor points for mooring. You need arrival, departure, and passenger processing zones. And you need it all to be coordinated across a vast network. That is the true definition of an aerial transit hub. Now, I want you to take that purely functional definition and hold it up against our old world heritage. We have been taught a very specific, very narrow version of history. The textbooks tell us that in the year 1750, there were no transit hubs. There were only coaching inns, port docks, and muddy river landings. Everything was modest, functional, and strictly scaled to the labor of humans and animals. But what happens when the physical evidence openly contradicts that official timeline? Why does this architecture exist if mainstream history says otherwise? Across Western Europe and early America, there are dozens of enormous enclosed structures dating back to the early and mid-1700s that perfectly fit the functional profile of an aerial transit hub. Not partially, not vaguely. They fit it with an unsettling mathematical precision. We are talking about long, unobstructed interior spans of 50 to 100 feet, vaulted ceilings that defy the supposed engineering limits of their era. External anchor rings, fixed at dizzying elevations, wide, flat approach corridors, sometimes paved, sometimes cleared of all natural obstructions for extraordinary distances. They even feature drainage systems of enormous sophistication channeling water away from what can only be described as massive loading surfaces. When you look at the official documents, these impossible buildings are hidden behind the vaguest descriptions imaginable. They are classified as grand depots, civic pavilions, or municipal halls of commerce. But the proportions are completely wrong for a traditional warehouse. If you are building a storage facility in the 18th century, you optimize for stackable vertical storage. You want walls close together. You want shelving. What these old-world structures optimize for is horizontal clearance, massive ceiling height, and wide lateral access. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not a warehouse. That is a hangar. We are looking at an incredibly advanced, secret system of infrastructure that was operating right under our noses. This was part of an old-world story that has been meticulously swept under the rug. In North America, there are structures from the mid to late colonial period, long before the Revolutionary War, that share these exact same impossible proportions. Grand civic buildings in early American cities with ceiling clearances that far exceed any functional need described in the historical record. And this brings us to a chilling realization. Why was this erased? Why would an advanced, global network of aerial infrastructure be reduced to vague footnotes and ignored by modern academia? Every layer of the official timeline we peel back reveals a deeper deception. They took this hidden reality and masked it with boring administrative labels. But the anchor rings are still there. The vaulted ceilings are still there. The architectural footprint of an erased civilization is staring us right in the face, daring us to question the narrative. I need to talk about the photographs. I know exactly what the skeptics are thinking. The 1700s predate photography. Practical photographic technology as we understand it doesn't arrive until the mid-19th century. I am not here to dispute the chemistry of early daguerreotypes and albumen prints from the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s. But there is a category of early photographic images that shows something the people taking those pictures apparently thought was completely ordinary, something so commonplace they didn't even bother to center it in the frame. Look closely at the background of these early urban skylines. Half obscured by architectural detail, you will see large, elongated aerial forms. These are not birds. These are not cloud anomalies. They are elongated, cigar-shaped structures, sometimes with visible gondola attachments beneath them. They are moored at rooftop height. They are hovering directly above the exact kind of massive clearance structures, the old-world airports we just discussed. The official history of lighter-than-air travel presents a very clean, progressive timeline. They tell us steerable airships and dirigibles didn't practically exist until the 1880s and 1890s, with Zeppelin technology arriving in the early 20th century. So why do photographs from decades earlier show more dirigibles against urban skylines? And why, when these impossible images are presented to the academic community, is the response not investigation, but immediate dismissal? They call them processing errors. They call them cloud formations. The silence from the establishment is deafening, and it points to a chilling conclusion. History deliberately falsified its own records to maintain the illusion of linear primitive progress. Here is where the mystery deepens, in a way that is impossible to rationalize away. These vast architectural features, the long approach corridors, the elevated anchor points, the suspiciously vague documentation, they are not confined to Western Europe or early America. They repeat across continents. In parts of Central Asia and the Russian steppe, explorers found massive structures associated with the remnants of a prior, highly advanced administrative civilization. This is exactly where the erased empire of Tartaria enters the conversation, not just as a myth, but as a physical descriptor for a globally coordinated society that existed long before our current historical consensus. How do you explain the exact same vaulted approach halls and incredibly overbuilt flooring in South American colonial administrative complexes? In regions where the Spanish colonial record obsessively documented every single nail and beam, these massive hubs are suspiciously labeled as nothing more than an administrative complex. The dates do not cooperate with the official story. Some of these structures are dated to periods when those regions were supposedly pre-industrial or entirely uninhabited. This is the next layer of the deception. Coordination on a global scale in the year 1720, or 1740, or 1760 was supposedly impossible. We are told they had no advanced communication, no shared engineering, and that these cultures were completely isolated. Yet, they built the exact same aerial transit hubs on 4 different continents. How do you build the same impossible building across the entire realm? And more importantly, why was this erased? Think about the life cycle of these massive structures. This is where the system reveals itself. A new transit technology is supposedly invented. The railroad era arrives, then early automotive, then modern aviation. And miraculously, these ancient structures are simply repurposed. They are converted to train stations, then converted again to aviation terminals. 3 separate transit modalities, 3 separate first users, all perfectly fitting into the exact same old-world footprint. Why does a building designed in 1740 happen to be perfectly suited for a technology that supposedly wouldn't be invented for another 160 years? They didn't build new infrastructure, they inherited it. They claimed it. And then they rewrote the history backward, telling us the huge ceilings and wide corridors were simply designed for the volume of civic commerce. The original documentation was systematically lost, classified, or absorbed into a comfortable lie. When the great surveying expeditions pushed into the territories designated on early maps as Tartaria, they didn't find empty plains. They found things: massive ruined structures, buildings of unusual precision, and colossal foundations that absolutely predate the primitive civilizations currently occupying those lands. In the official records of those expeditions, these findings are neatly documented and then deliberately set aside, classified as ruins of unknown origin. Unknown origin. That phrase does a lot of heavy lifting in our history books. The deeper I went into these expedition logs from the Russian interior and Central Asia, the more that pattern of deliberate vagueness appeared. Mainstream historians systematically refused to integrate this anomalous evidence into their accepted timeline. And here is the detail that keeps me awake at night. The aerial technology vanishes. It does not fade slowly. It does not gradually decline the way normal technologies do, leaving behind a trail of transitional blueprints or an archaeology of replacement. It vanishes with a sudden, chilling completeness. If a global airship infrastructure existed in the early 18th century, what should we find? We should find engineering notes. We should find legal records of liability, accidents, and insurance documents. The bureaucratic residue of an active society. Instead, we find a manufactured silence. And when that silence ends in the mid-19th century, lighter-than-air flight is presented to the masses as an entirely new invention. But what if they weren't inventions? What if the esteemed engineers of the 19th century were not originating ideas, but simply recovering them? But they were working from fragments, reverse engineering the massive, vaguely documented buildings that were still standing in European and American cities. How do you reinvent a concept when the physical infrastructure for it is still dominating your city skyline? You cover it up. You absorb the original anomaly into a new progressive narrative. Because they didn't just erase the airports. The suppression of this old-world heritage is everywhere, and it is the exact same tactic used to hide the truth about the missing 1890 census. Why was the year 1890 so critical that the physical records mysteriously burned? The deeper you dig, the more the timeline fractures. We are told the world went dark in 536 AD, but what if that was a deliberate reset? What if the impossible engineering of 1855, when they supposedly jacked up the entire city of Chicago on wooden screws, was actually the unearthing of old-world underground cities? The system lies by omission. They tell you America had no banks before 1863 to obscure the ancient, localized economic systems of the past. They destroy the physical evidence, just like the 1929 destruction of the massive atmospheric energy bells. They hide the skeletal remains of the last living giants and the anomalous giant children, quietly locking them away as 1900 Smithsonian artifacts, never to be seen again. Even suppressed technology, like the impossible 124-year bulb or the massive old-world hydraulic power grid, is quickly confiscated by the authorities. And the last witness to the true timeline was likely silenced by 1953. Every piece of anomalous evidence is sanded down to fit the lie. Every 2 minutes you look at this, you have to ask, why was this erased? To keep us disconnected from our true potential. This is not a conspiracy of shadowy men in a smoke-filled room. It is quieter. It is the tendency of official institutions to prefer a cohesive lie over a messy truth. The archives close around the comfortable explanation, like water around a stone. The early photographs captured the lingering aerial vehicles. But as the 20th century approached, and archival practices became more strictly controlled, those anomalies systematically disappeared from the sky. They didn't just edit the books, they censored the horizon. Let me return to the photographs, because this is where the timeline completely unravels. There is a specific category of early photographic image, and I have spent considerable time in digitized archives tracing these exact anomalies. The objects in the background, those elongated aerial forms, appear specifically in images associated with the known large clearance structures we have been discussing. These are images taken from vantage points that suggest the photographer was simply documenting the grand building, not the sky. And yet there, in the sky, or hovering just above the roofline against the distant horizon, there is the form. It is elongated. It is deliberate. It is entirely too consistent in its shape across different images, captured by different photographers in different cities and across different decades, to be a mere processing artifact. We are looking at urban photography from the 1850s and 1860s, the very early days of documenting our cities in Europe and North America. In these precise images, these aerial forms appear above structures that were, within a few short decades, formally redesignated as transit hubs the moment rail technology supposedly arrived. It is the exact same building. It is the exact same skyline. The aerial form is present in the earlier image, yet entirely absent in the later ones as the 20th century approached. Why? Why was this erased? As the technology of cameras became more reliable, you would expect clearer pictures of these craft. Instead, the archives became more carefully curated. The horizon was sanitized. Ask yourself this: Why would an image processing artifact appear consistently and only above a specific category of building? Why would random cloud formations mathematically cluster over structures with massive iron anchor rings at rooftop height? Why would the anomalies, whatever they truly are, appear in early photographs and then systematically disappear from the recorded history as archival practices became more rigorous? The evidence suggests something much larger, much more coordinated than coincidence. I am not telling you what to blindly believe. I am showing you what I found buried in the margins. I am asking the questions that I found completely impossible to stop asking once I saw the pattern. Here is the realization I keep returning to, a smaller secret hidden inside the massive deception. If any part of this architectural evidence is true, if those colossal structures were built for an advanced system of aerial transit, if the technology existed centuries earlier than we are told, and if those early photographs captured something real, then who actually built it? The old world story points to a unified, highly capable civilization that spanned the earth. But I want to sit with the physical evidence rather than immediately naming a specific empire, because the moment you name a power, you give the establishment a reason to dismiss you as mythology. And I am strictly interested in the undeniable physical evidence of an erased reality. The structures physically exist. They are standing today, still bearing their anomalous features, still documented in original surveys that you can access if you know where to dig through the hidden archives. The early photographs exist. The vague, dismissive designations in the official historical record exist. The unbroken pattern of convenient repurposing exists. Something built those structures. Something used them to navigate the skies. Something, and this is the word I keep coming back to time and time again, something was lost, but it was not misplaced. It was not forgotten in the way that small, insignificant things fade away. It was lost in a way that requires active, intentional losing. It is the kind of massive loss that leaves behind only the naked physical evidence, deliberately stripped of its true context, relabeled by the victors, and absorbed into a completely different, primitive timeline. The kind of loss that looks from a distance like it was perfectly intentional. A meticulous campaign to ensure the hidden history of humanity remained out of reach, ensuring we never look up and ask what those massive approach corridors were actually leading to. I started this entire investigation staring at a 40-foot ceiling in a supposed customs depot from the 18th century. I end it here, looking upward, left with a simpler, far more terrifying question. What was actually in the sky? Not the empty, primitive sky we are sold in textbooks. What were those massive iron anchor rings truly waiting to catch? Where were those vast approach corridors leading? When the architects of this erased civilization stood on those elevated platforms, what massive shadows drifted over them? Once you recognize the pattern of the old world, you can never unsee it. The impossible clearances, the vague labels, the mysterious photographs deliberately hidden. You see the word unknown stamped on documents spanning from continent to continent. Unknown origin, unknown function, unknown date. A deafening, manufactured silence. What do we genuinely know about the sky above our cities in the year 1740, or 1720, or 1690, and more importantly, what have we collectively agreed never to ask? The colossal buildings are still standing in our downtowns. The anchor rings are still bolted to the stone. The sky above is still wide open. Between the official lie we have been fed, and the massive physical evidence staring us in the face, there is a gap large enough to fit an entirely different reality, a lost world of majestic departure and arrival. I leave you with this. The next time you walk past a grand historic station, look up at those vaulted ceilings and ask yourself, if they lied about who ruled the sky, what else are they hiding right beneath your feet? Let me know what you think in the comments.